This is the first reading passage. It's actually pretty easy, so I'm not going to do much by way of summary. We should read the blurb. It says, the passage is adapted from Michael Ondaatje, The Cat's Table. The novel's narrator reflects on his journey as a young boy traveling by ship from the former British colony Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, to England during the 1950s. Ramadan and Cassius are friends he made during the journey. So the first paragraph introduces us to the guy, Mr. Fonseca, traveling to England to be a teacher. And the narrator says he would visit him every few days. And obviously, the theme of books is going to come by. It says he knew passages and read all kinds of books that he could recite by heart. And the narrator says, line 5, I knew scarcely a thing about the world of literature, but he welcomed me with unusual and interesting stories. So that's how their relationship went along. The next paragraph started in line 15, just talks about some of his mannerisms, his appearance. He was gracious with his quietness. So he seems like a relatively quiet guy. It says, line 18, he was not used to public effort, even though he is now going to be a part of the public world as a teacher of literature and history in England. So that's his specific job. Paragraph after that basically says, like, the narrator tried to get him up on deck a few times, but Mr. Fonseca basically stayed in his same place, and he had no need to leave his time capsule. And then a little bit more about the background of Mr. Fonseca. It said he had lived in Colombo all his life, and his manner and his accent were a product of the island, but at the same time he had this wide-ranging knowledge of books. He'd sing a song from the Azores, so it's kind of a contrast between his personal background and the knowledge that he gains from books. And then it says he brought Cassius and Ramadan to meet him. Those are the friends that he made on the ship. And then again, the narrator is thinking about what Mr. Fonseca, what's going to happen to him. So it says he would not be a wealthy man, and it would be a spare life as a school teacher. But on the other hand, he had the serenity that came with the choice of the life that he wanted to live. So again, another contrast between his outward circumstances and the inner life that he has with books. So that's kind of a theme that comes up again. And even the narrator in line 51 says, I'm aware of the pathos and the irony that come with such a portrait. And again, this contrast between line 55, him leading a humble but good life as an Asian in England, where something like his Latin grammar could be a distinguishing sword. So again, it seems like he's got this sort of mightiness and this power from the fact that he's well-read, he knows literature, yet at the same time, outwardly, his life is very humble. At this point in line 58, we have a shift in time. Notice what it says, I wonder what happened to him. So now we're kind of in the present time, and you realize everything that we read before that was in the past. And so it says in line 59, I'll look up any reference to Fonseca in a library. It says Ramadan kept in touch with him, but I did not. And then the last paragraph, he's basically just imagining more about Mr. Fonseca. I think about Mr. Fonseca at those English schools, wearing his button sweater to protect himself. And then he kind of just guesses what he did. It says, line 69, I wonder how long he stayed there, if he really did stay forever, or if in the end he could no longer survive it, line 71. And instead return home on Air Lanka and blah, blah, blah. So overall, the passage is really just him remembering encountering Mr. Fonseca on the trip, and then the last couple paragraphs are his reflections on that time, guessing where he was. A pretty straightforward passage. Question 1, over the course of the passage, the narrator's focus shifts from a description of the internal world of a character to an expression of sympathy for that character. I would say the internal world of Mr. Fonseca is kind of spread throughout the passage, and there is sympathy for him throughout the passage. There's no real, shift from one to the other. So A doesn't really seem right to me. We'll keep it around. B, a recollection of interactions with a character, to speculation about that character's life. So yeah, that definitely was the case. Like I said, the first page or first part of the passage was a recollection, and then the last two paragraphs are basically when the author starts to think about, hey, what happened to this guy? What's he doing now? And so that's speculation. So B is definitely better than A. C, the discussion of a character's history to a recounting of an important turning point. So there really wasn't any important turning point that was mentioned. There could have been a turning point if he ended up going back to Sri Lanka and leaving England, but that was just the author's speculation. We don't know if that actually happened. We also don't really know much about his history. I mean, we know a little bit here and there, but again, just like A, there's not really this shift from one to the other. Choice D, the narration of a childhood experience to that event's impact on the narrator's life. D is probably the closest after choice B. You could argue that, like, hey, being on the boat was a childhood experience. Do we really know what that event's impact on the narrator's life is today? I would say we probably don't, because the last two paragraphs don't really talk about how knowing Mr. Fonseca on the boat affected the narrator today. It's more, the last two paragraphs are him just continuing to think about Mr. Fonseca and what he's doing. So speculation about his life is much better than impact on the narrator's life. So B is going to be the answer. Question 2, the narrator indicates that his acquaintance with Mr. Fonseca influenced him because Mr. Fonseca, so no line reference, let's just read through it real quickly, inspired him to become a writer. So that wasn't mentioned anywhere in the paragraph, although we do know that the narrator is kind of a writer because it came from his novel. Assuming that's actually true, he could be imagining a character having that experience. Choice B, motivated him to pursue teaching. Nothing in the passage about the narrator pursuing teaching. C, taught him to memorize stories. Also, I think he definitely told him stories. I don't think there was anything about him memorizing stories. D, introduced him to literature. That one seems the best. You can actually find that in the first paragraph. Let's take a look. Remember that it says in line 5, I scarcely knew a thing about the world of literature, but he welcomed me with unusual and interesting stories, stopping abruptly in mid-tale and saying that someday I should find out what happened after that. Question 3, the narrator's use of stalking in line 12 has the main effect of, start at line 11, often during the night, while stalking the ship with Ramadan and Cassius, I'd attempt to add to the bare bones of an adventure Mr. Fonseca had left unfinished. So you guys probably know the word stalking, like one person stalks another. In this case, when they're saying stalking the ship, it sounds a lot more like kind of wandering the ship, possibly exploring. To me, it makes it sound like, hey, they're kind of on an adventure and they're just, kind of moving around. So let's see what the answer choices say. Conveying a sense of fear shared by the narrator and his friends. So we don't really get a sense of fear. Like there's nothing really to be afraid of, at least nothing that they mentioned. Choice B, bringing a feeling of intrigue to an otherwise ordinary activity. So yeah, intrigue, suggests that something is like mysterious or interesting or fascinating. And yeah, like I said, when I was reading it, you get the sense of like, they're on this adventure on the ship and it's at night. And so B seems to work. C, characterize the friendship between the narrator and his friends. So I don't know if by saying they're stalking the ship says anything about the friendship of the narrator and the friends. Choice D, portraying the narrator as overly dramatic. I don't really think that's the purpose of stalking the ship either. It's not to say that the narrator says or does things that are very dramatic. So all that means is that B is probably the best answer. Question 4, the second paragraph serves mainly two, so let's look at those lines. So what we'll notice is that the second paragraph basically describes Mr. Fonseca. It says he was gracious, he was quiet. When he spoke, he was tentative and languid. It says that I understood the rareness by the pace of his gestures. So he's, obviously a very unique guy. He stood up only when it was essential, as if he were a sick cat. He was not used to public effort, even though he was now going to be a part of a school in England. So basically the whole paragraph just talks about a little bit about Mr. Fonseca, the impression that he made on the narrator, his physical appearance. Choice A, illustrate how certain traits in a character can undermine a character's goals. So undermine means to weaken. There's nothing in that paragraph that said that his traits kind of weakened his goals, Mr. Fonseca's. B, provide essential details about a character's past that foreshadow the character's future. This is just a more neutral description about the character, not so much his past, and they're not foreshadowing his future either. C, reveal personal information about a character that explains the character's internal conflict. I'm not really sure what they mean about personal information. We also don't really get a sense that there's any internal conflict. There is a contrast that's obviously mentioned in the last sentence. He was not used to public effort, but he was now going to be a part of a public world. But I'd say there's no evidence that Mr. Fonseca himself was conflicted about that. So that seems to me to be going a little bit too far. Choice D, demonstrate how a character's external mannerisms reflect that character's inner being. So yeah, this is a much safer answer because they are talking about how he looks and how he acts and what's going on inside. And so that's actually much safer than choice C. So we'll go with D. Question 5, the narrator indicates that he visited Mr. Fonseca's cabin on the ship when the narrator, and again, no line reference, so we can just look through it. A, felt that there was nothing else more interesting to do. So yeah, it did actually say this in the beginning. Let's take a look. And the answer is basically right here in line 25. I would visit that room if the day was dull, and he would at some point begin reading to me. So that's how they get choice A. B, had concerns about Mr. Fonseca's reclusive habits. So they do mention his reclusive habits in that paragraph where it said, I tried to get him to go up to the deck, but there's no indication that he visited him whenever he had those concerns. He basically just had those concerns in general. C, when the narrator wanted to borrow some of his books, we don't really get the sense that he went to see him just to borrow his books. D, had remembered the ending to a story he enjoyed. I don't really think, or he had not remembered, I don't really think he went to Mr. Fonseca because he's like, oh, because I, forgot what you said or forgot about how that story ended. It seems like he just kind of went there like randomly and like it said, when he was bored. So A is going to be the best answer. So 6 and 7 should be done together. Let's read the answers for 6 first. In the passage, the narrator finds it a significant contradiction in Mr. Fonseca's character that he, A, recites works about the outdoors but rarely leaves his room. I think that's a possibility. They did mention both of those. Enjoys sharing stories but does not finish telling them. I don't really think he didn't finish telling them, but we'll have to check on the answers. C, has read extensively about the world but has experienced very little of it. That was definitely mentioned in those paragraphs that we looked at. So I think C is a good contender. D, has chosen to pursue a career as a teacher but has shown small interest in it. This one seems a little bit off. I don't really think that it said anywhere that he's not interested in teaching. So to me, it's probably going to be A or C. So let's take a look at the evidence. And so in our minds, we're looking for a contradiction in his character, and we're figuring out what that is. Lines 5 to 9. Start here. I knew scarcely a thing about the world of literature, but he welcomed me with unusual and interesting stories, stopping abruptly in mid-tale and saying that someday I should find out what happened after that. So this is A, no real contradiction in Mr. Fonseca's character here, so probably not it. A is out. Choice B, 18 to 20. He was not used to public effort, even though he was now going to be a part of a public world as a teacher of literature and history in England. So there's definitely a contradiction, not used to public effort, but he's going to be a part of a public world. So let's take a look at the first question. Recites work about the outdoors, but rarely leaves his room. Has read extensively about the world, but has experienced very little of it. So yeah, B down here does seem to go along with choice C up here. So that's a possibility. Let's check the rest just to be sure. C, 21 to 23. I tried to coax him up on deck a few times, but his porthole and what he could see through it seemed enough nature for him. So no contradictions in his character here. C is out. D, 31 to 33. He had lived in Colombo all his life, and his manner and accent were a product of the island, but at the same time, he had this wide-ranging knowledge of books. D. So yeah, this is definitely a contradiction about him being on the island. At the same time, he had this wide-ranging knowledge of books. So looking up at the answers again, recites works about the outdoors, but rarely leaves his room. It wasn't so much about his room, it was more about him being on the island only. Has read extensively about the world, but has experienced very little of it. So yeah, I would say D also goes along with choice C. So now the question is, 6 is C, but what's better, choice B or choice D? Let's look at line 18 to 20 again. So if we're looking at choice B, it says he's not used to public effort, even though he's now going to be a part of the public world, versus he lived in Colombo all his life, but he had this wide-ranging knowledge. I would say choice D is definitely a better choice to match up with reading extensively about the world, but experiencing very little of it. So we'll go with C in 6 and D in 7. Question 8 and 9 should also be done together. It says, in the passage, the narrator speculates that Mr. Fonseca likely believed that his knowledge of literary classics would... All right, so this is the narrator's speculation because we don't really know what Mr. Fonseca actually believes. So let's look at it. Enable him to better understand English people, possibly. Earn him respect in his new country. I think that worked. Bring him great financial success. No, if you remember, it said that his life would be very spare. So definitely not C as a teacher. D, be a gateway to many possible professions. I'm not really sure about that. Many possible professions. We'll keep that in mind, but I think it's either going to be A or B. Now choice 9, which choice provides the best evidence? So choice A is 43 to 47. And we're keeping in mind either it helped him better understand English people or it helped him earn respect in his new country, his literary knowledge. So how did his literary knowledge help him? 43, you can start over here. I suppose he remembered these things to clarify his own opinions, like a man buttoning up his own sweater to give warmth just to himself. Mr. Fonseca would not be a wealthy man, and it would be a spare life he would be certain to lead as a school teacher. So nothing about how his knowledge of literature is going to help him here. That's choice A. B, 47 to 50. But he had a serenity that came with the choice of a life he wanted to live, and that serenity and certainty I have seen only among those who have the armor of books close by. So this is choice B. So this is basically saying that his knowledge of books have given him serenity, which is like peacefulness, calmness, and certainty. Going back to these answers, there's really nothing in question 8 about serenity and peacefulness, so probably not going to be it. A is out, B is out. Look at choice C, 54 to 57. He must have believed it would be a humble but good life for an Asian living in England, where something like his Latin grammar could be a distinguishing sword. So yeah, this does sound like his knowledge of literature is going to help him. Looking back at question 8, it seems like B would be the better answer to go with that line. And so for now, we'll basically just say that choice C goes with choice B, as opposed to better understanding English people. Last piece of evidence is 75 to 77. It says, were all those memorized paragraphs and stanzas of the European canon he brought back the equivalent of a bottle of river water? So we don't really get a sense that his knowledge of all this is helping him in any certain way. So that's choice D. So that means for question 9, we're going to go with C. And in question 8, we're going to go with B. Question 10, when the narrator refers to the equivalent of a bottle of river water in line 75, he's suggesting that the literature Mr. Fonseca memorized will be. So we have to go back to that and get a sense of what's going on there first. Now remember that this paragraph is the narrator speculating about what Mr. Fonseca would do. He says he wonders how long he stayed there and if he really did stay forever, or whether in the end he could no longer survive it, even though for him it was a center of culture, and instead returned home on an Air Lanka flight that took 2/3 of a day, that's a long flight, to begin again teaching in a place like Negugoda. London returned, where all those memorized paragraphs and stanzas of the European canon he brought back, the equivalent of a bottle of river water. We're talking about a bottle of river water. That's something that you kind of collect, and it seems like bring to a new place. So really he's saying all those memorized paragraphs and stanzas were like this thing that he's able to carry with him. So let's look at the answers. A memento of a place left behind. Yeah, that makes sense. Memento is something that helps keep memories. Necessary item for personal use. So obviously the bottle of water is not, they're not saying this is like for personal use. It's a metaphor really. Choice C, charm bringing good luck. So the bottle of river water is not for the purpose of good luck. We said that it was more for his memories and his knowledge. Reminder of past enjoyments. I'd say enjoyments is a little bit off. If it's remembering a place that you left behind versus past enjoyments, then A is going to be better.